Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to join all of my colleagues who have stood previously to compliment you on the incredible work and leadership that you've shown in a number of ways, the budget being one of them. And I certainly, in the limited amount of time that I've been able to spend as one of your colleagues, gained a tremendous amount of respect for you. I think you're a very honorable person, and I think you try very, very hard to do what you believe is in the best interest of Texas. And I know that that's what you're advancing today, that comes from your heart, that belief. But I have some questions for you in terms of some things that are troubling still to me, and I know are troubling to the constituents that I represent and others of us here represent. And it really starts by going back and looking at some of the decisions that have been made by this legislature in the last few sessions. In 2003, I think it was mentioned previously by Senator Ellis, a decision was made to deregulate college tuition, and that was done in a tough budget climate. And I'm sure it was a very tough decision for the people who made it here. And clearly, it was an effort to move off of the state's balance sheet an obligation to our public university system that we didn't feel like we could afford anymore, and to allow them to create a revenue source that could offset that. And that revenue source was tuition increases. And we know what happened from that. We know that the rise in tuition has been exponential, and Senator Whitmire just talked about an increase that's going to occur from the University of Houston that he's heard about, just anticipating the impact of this budget. In 2006, a decision was made to change the way we fund our public school systems. And at the time the decision was made, the comptroller said, this is a mistake. It's going to underfund. The margins tax isn't going to make it up. And she was right. And this session, when the Finance Committee began its meetings, the comptroller that is in place right now told us that the underfunding from that system put us in a position of starting our budget discussions at a $10 billion deficit. And I admired so tremendously when you stood up and you made your comments at the beginning of the session that you said we needed to do something about that. And I know you meant that. And I also know that you've tried to do something about that. I know you've advanced some ideas to do something about that. And they didn't make it into this document that you're presenting today. But I'm worried that we're falling into a pattern and that we're about to make another decision that's going to put us on a course 2 years from now or 4 years from now. A senator is going to be standing on this floor and they're going to say, remember back in 2011 when we did this? Remember what happened? Remember what the consequence was? Just like we're able to say now about 2003 and 2006. I think when you laid out the budget just now in your remarks, you talked about how much we're appropriating, and it's, I think, $11 billion more than the House has appropriated in their proposed budget. And you talked about how we're going to fill that gap. One of the things you said is $3 billion in transportation borrowing. And yes, our voters approved doing that a couple of years ago, Proposition 12. But we're going to be borrowing money. And we're not sure really what our economic picture is going to look like, and we're not sure really our ability to commit to the repayment obligation of borrowing $3 billion. So it's a risk. Would you agree? There's some risk there?
Yes.
And then we did the Senate Bill 1811 that Senator Duncan advanced, and I voted for, and a lot of our colleagues here on the floor voted for. But I think we all understood at the time that it's a little bit of a house of cards maneuver. It's going to get us through this short term. We moved off $2.2 billion from Foundation School Program into the next session. We collected ahead on some taxes, sped up some things, and they're all honest efforts to get through a short-term problem, but they're not long-term fixes. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So we have $3 billion that we're borrowing for transportation. We've got our $4 billion that we added. That's a little bit of that rickety tax system, I'm afraid, that you worry about. I know you do, sincerely, and I do too. We talked about, Senator Watson talked about using the dedicated funds, and that there's about $4 billion of that, and I think you questioned whether that number might be accurate, but we know it's a big number. There's a very large number where we're using dedicated funds that our taxpayers paid for one purpose, and we're putting them into an account so that we can certify the budget. You also talked about the fact that for Medicaid, in your rider today, if $3 billion is moved off in terms of what we might take from the rainy day fund, the way that we'll make up that difference is we'll move off some of our Medicaid obligation, and if the revenue picture doesn't get better in Texas, we're going to have to ultimately look to the rainy day fund to make that up. And we already knew, as you also said, in the budget as it's planned today, we were going to have to look to that rainy day fund to fill $3 billion of our Medicaid obligation, likely, if revenue didn't increase. So we know that possibly in the future, we're putting off for another day, and probably coming out of the rainy day fund, another, I think you said it was $4.1 billion of a Medicaid obligation that we have today in this budget. It's in this budget, $4.1 billion. And so I think you can understand why some of us begin to worry that ultimately this house of cards is going to come tumbling down around us, and Senates in years ahead are going to look back and say, what were they doing? Why weren't they thinking more long-term in their solution making? And I know we're desperate for solutions to a financial crisis, and I know we're dealing with a political situation where it's hard to get enough people to agree to do the brave and courageous things that need to be done to really responsibly manage our way forward. But I don't think this would be your preference. Would it be? Would you defend this as being a tremendously responsible way of solving the state fiscal matters that have put us where we are?
Well, you know, I keep qualifying that. Within the constraints that we have to operate, yes. I mean, when all revenue bills by Constitution have to start in the House, we do not have the option to even consider revenue-raising measures. The people of the state of Texas spoke loudly and clearly last November. They didn't send anybody down here to start raising revenue for them. So I need to at least say that in these constraints, we need to respect what I think was a very loud and clear message last November. Now, within the constraints that I have to operate, I'm positive this is a responsible budget. Positive. We are not doing anything in this budget that I believe will ultimately harm Texas. What I believe is that if we don't pass this budget, we'll ultimately harm Texas. But this budget and the way we're going to finance it, I think, is well within the range of what I would call responsible and prudent behavior.